Can you talk about when a person is water fasting, what's happening with the loss of sodium and the flushing out of water and that kind of stuff that's happening in their body, and then also the other good things that are happening at the same time?
Well, there's a lot of biological changes that happen
And
in
the
fasting.
detoxification too, like that
Yeah,
whole.
it's a pretty big, pretty big topic, and it would be difficult to get into all the detailed physiology. What I can talk in general terms, though, is the body shifts, as I mentioned, from burning glucose to burning essentially fat. That, it turns out, it has some advantages, and a lot of people are trying to do fasting mimicking type effects. In other words, do what fasting does, but without actually having to fast. And I don't know how well that's going to turn out to work, but we do know in fasting, when the body's in a ketotic state and the brain is burning primarily beta-hydroxybutyric acid, lots of things change. Some things go down and some things go up. And for example, glucose and insulin go down during fasting as the ketones go up. And that creates an environment that's very favorable to healthy cells, but not favorable to cancer cells. Cancer have higher metabolic rates than regular cells. And when you lower the glucose environment, they are selectively disadvantaged. And that's where Walter Longo has been able to show that in cancer, cancer cells are more vulnerable to chemotherapy, for example, in the fasting state than in the fed state, and that healthy cells are protected from some of the damaging effects of conventional therapy. Once that was published, then the pharmaceutical people said, oh, great, well, fasting went from criminal quackery to cutting-edge research because you do more conventional therapy with less side effects. So there became a big interest there. And now they want to come up with what are called fasting-mimicking drugs. So things you take that would get your body to do what fasting does, but without having to actually give up anything, and something you can put in a capsule and sell. Fasting reduces IGF-1, which is insulin growth factor 1. The lower your IGF-1 in general, the better off you are in terms of surviving. And there's two things we know that lower IGF-1 consistently. One is fasting and the other is exercise. And, you're going to hear this over and over again. The same biomarkers that change with exercise often change with fasting. And you might think, well, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. In fasting, you're saying you're resting. Exercise, you're vigorously active. Why would they both work on the same biomarkers? And it's going to turn out that fasting and exercise have one very important thing in common, is they both undo the consequences of dietary excess. And so it's not surprising to find out that the biomarker changes that are benefited by exercise are also benefited by fasting. For example, leptin. Leptin goes down in fasting, and the lower your leptin level, the lower the inflammation in general. Blood pressure and heart rate levels go down with fasting. And ultimately, as a consequence of exercise, although during exercise, obviously, they go up. mTOR is a mammalian target of rapamycin, and that increases the lower your mTOR, the higher autophagy. And autophagy or autophagy is the self-eating that where your body's immune system goes in there and gets rid of cancer cells, gets rid of the cellular debris that's associated with the breakdown of cells. And in fact, Yoshinori Ishimi won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for his work on autophagy. And one of the things that apparently dramatically enhances autophagy is fasting. Fasting also reduces the microbial load in the intestinal tract. In fact, you have about 5 pounds of bacteria living in your intestinal tract. Think about that. 1 trillion creatures, living creatures, swimming around inside your digestive system, eating, drinking, and defecating inside you right now. You've got 5 pounds of creatures pooing inside your digestive system. And they might be pooing toxic waste like TMA, which becomes trimethylamine oxidase and irritates the inner lining of your blood vessels and causes heart disease and cancer and all kinds. Or it could be pooing fertilizer like vitamin K and stuff you need. So you have to say, what determines whether your bacteria poo toxic waste in you or they poo fertilizer in you? And it's what you feed them. If you feed your organisms soluble fibers, your vegetables and sweet potatoes and all that stuff, you get fertilizer. If you feed them too much meat, fish, fowl, eggs, and dairy products, you get toxic waste. That's one of the reasons TMA levels are so much higher in meat eaters than in plant eaters. And so the type of bacteria you have are determined by what you eat, and also how much of the bacteria you have are determined by what you eat. And it turns out it's not so much how much that's important as what is important. The broader your diversity, is thought to be associated with higher levels of immune protection, not just against cancer and heart disease, but even things like COVID-19. Gut diversity is associated with a higher level of resistance, lower likelihood of ending up in the hospital or dying or whatever, from infectious disease, from chronic disease. And what gives you the best diversity is a variety of plant-based foods. And so one of the reasons why these plant-based diets may enhance immunological function is because of the effect on the microbiome. And it's very, very important part of your immune system. In fact, if you take human beings and you divide them into two piles, human cells and non-human cells, it turns out the pile of cells that's non-human is actually bigger than the pile of cells that's human. You're more non-human cells than human cells, which is kind of bizarre when you think about it. And so it's important that you feed those cells that are protecting you by their diversity the right foods. And it turns out in fasting, there's a dramatic shift that happens with the microbiome in your body. And what happens is there's a big die-off. And then when you refeed properly after fasting, you get the big increasing diversity is the thought that happens. And a lot of these conditions associated with gut leakage and microbiome balance appear to heal during fasting and resolve and are better managed post-fasting. Now, we've actually done a study on this where we took stool samples before, after, and on long-term follow-up to look at this diversity. In fact, we did that with Luigi Fontana from Washington University. We don't have the results of that study yet, but we're waiting and we're very excited. We know clinically what happens, but we don't have the numbers to cite yet. Other things that go down in fasting, perhaps one of the most powerful reductions in fasting is inflammation. And the way we know that isn't just because the pain goes away, because the biomarkers associated with inflammation like IL-6 and TNF-alpha and all these other sophisticated biomarkers consistently, predictably go down during fasting. And actually, interestingly enough, if you follow it with a whole plant food SOS-free diet, they stay down, which is why we probably see such dramatic results in autoimmune diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, ulcerative colitis, ankylosing spondylitis, and diseases like asthma, eczema, psoriasis. In fact, we've got a paper coming out this year on plaque psoriasis, and it's really dramatic because you can see the pictures and the changes during fasting. It's really quite impressive. And then fasting reduces all of the abnormalities associated with metabolic syndrome. And honestly, metabolic syndrome is the epidemic that's killing most of the people prematurely in our society today. And in fact, you'll find probably the biggest risk factor for dying from, say, for example, COVID or other infections, influenza, et cetera, is having metabolic syndrome. Obesity, elevated lipids, elevated blood pressure, elevated blood glucose. We know that it takes 4 risk factors on average to have a high risk of mortality. And so metabolic syndrome gets to combine all of these wonderful consequences of dietary excess in one little package. And fasting is perhaps the most powerful way of reversing metabolic syndrome that I've witnessed, read about, seen, or anything else. Now, not everything goes down during fasting. Some things go up in fasting. So, for example, things like adenopectin and ghrelin go up. And the higher they are, the better your insulin sensitivity is, which may be why diabetics, type 2 diabetics, respond so well to fasting. And then there's other biomarkers like AMPK, which is activated protein kinase. That downregulates PGC1 alpha, which is peroxisome proliferator activated receptor. And that increases mitochondrial biogenesis. And that's the bottom line, is that when you fast, there's more mitochondrial biogenesis. That's the little energy producing mechanisms in the cells themselves, which may explain one of the mechanisms why these patients with chronic fatigue and seem to respond so well. It may be literally because they're making more mitochondria. We talked about the fuel that the brain burns in fasting is primarily beta-hydroxybutyric acid, BHB. It turns out the higher your BHB, the more you produce something called BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And brain-derived neurotrophic factor is the neurochemical that prevents your brain nerve tissues from being damaged from oxidative damage from the crappy foods and the other inflammatory products. And that's associated with Alzheimer's disease. So and the other thing that increases BDNF is, guess what? Exercise. Longo talks about, they took 30 rats in 2 cages, genetically bred rats, so they're identical, fed the same, everything's the same, but they gave one set of rats a wheel, and the rats would exercise. And the exercise rats didn't get Alzheimer's disease. They wouldn't get the brain breakdown. They said, why? What's going on? So they check it all out, and they figured out it was because they had much higher BDNF levels, dramatically higher. Exercise increases BDNF. BDNF protects the brain from degeneration. Well, the other thing that profoundly affects BDNF, it turns out, is fasting. Fasting stimulates B-cell immunity. It helps reboot the gut. And so there's a lot of stuff going on in fasting. Some stuff's going down, some stuff's going up. What we're able to see is the clinical outcome.
Thanks for watching. If you like what you just saw, why not subscribe? Here's a link to do that. And if you'd like to watch the full interview, you can find it at chrisbeatcancer.com. There's a link to it in the description right below this video.